The Tiara Club at Rubik Mansions. Princess Amy and the Golden Coach. Vivian French. Chapter 1. 1 2 3 twirl. 1 2 3 twirl. Fairy Angora waved her wand in time to the music. We did our best to follow her instructions, but it wasn't easy. I kept getting dizzy and bumping into my friends. Please, Fairy Angora, couldn't you help us with a bit of magic? As I spoke, I found I'd twirled myself into a corner and had to come out backwards. I'm so not good at ballet. Fairy Angora, she's the assistant fairy godmother at the Princess Academy, laughed. That would be cheating, my angel, she said. Ballet teaches you grace and poise. If I did it by magic, it would fade away, and then what would happen at tomorrow's end-of-term dancing display? Diamond sniggered. Amy will be stamping about like a big fat elephant. Fairy Angora gave her a frosty look. That, Diamond, is not a kind or helpful thing to say. Please show us your very best pirouette. Diamond looked so horribly pleased with herself as she stepped forward. Certainly, Fairy Angora, she said, and she did 3 perfect pirouettes one after the other, ending with the most beautiful curtsy. We couldn't help bursting into a massive round of applause. She was really good. Of course, Diamond looked more smug than ever. Well done, Diamond, Fairy Angora said, but she didn't sound as pleased as she usually does when one of us does something right. I can see you've had lots of lessons. You may have 2 Tiara points. And she went to talk to the musicians. Diamond and I have been going to ballet since we were 3, Gruella told us. Mummy says it's so important that princesses like us have every opportunity to learn to be graceful. That's right. Diamond gave me a snooty look. I don't suppose your parents thought such things mattered, and that's why you're so hopeless. I stared at her in absolute amazement. You don't know anything about my parents. I said. How can you say such things? If you really want to know, I did go to ballet when I was little, but... I hesitated. Did I really want Diamond and Gruella to know about my family? But then I thought, hey, I'm proud of my mom and dad. So I went on. But the lessons were too expensive. They've hardly got any money, but they always want me to have the best. Why, they even canceled a wonderful royal tour so I could come here in their very special traveling coach. Diamond stuck her nose in the air. Huh. I saw you arrive. That wasn't a very special coach. Why, it wasn't even gold. Didn't you know that perfect princesses always travel in golden coaches? Luckily for me, Fairy Angora came hurrying back just then, otherwise I would have said something that would not have been at all princessy. Did I hear you mention a golden coach? She asked, and she looked very anxious. Oh no! Has somebody told you Queen Fabiola's secret? Of course we all shook our heads except for Diamond. She winked at Gruella and said, well, someone might have told us about a very special coach. It was so obvious she didn't really know anything, but Fairy Angora didn't seem to notice. She sat down on a chair looking very upset. Queen Fabiola will be furious. She wanted it to be such a wonderful surprise. The most beautiful golden coach you've ever seen to take you to the end-of-term celebration ball. Chapter 2. We didn't know what to say. Fairy Angora had just told us our head teacher's secret, and we weren't meant to know. Gruella put her hand up. How will we all fit into one coach? She asked. And why isn't the ball going to be here OUCH? She turned and glared at Diamond. Why did you pinch me? SSSSSH. Diamond hissed, but she was too late. Fairy Angora was staring at her, her eyes wide. You didn't know about the Queen's secret surprise, did you, Diamond? Because if someone really had told you, you'd know the ball was going to be at Pearl Palace. And you'd know that only the very best dancers will be traveling in the golden coach. You were just pretending you knew. Diamond shuffled her feet. I only said someone might have told us, she muttered. Fairy Angora clutched her wand. Oh, how silly I am. She looked round at us all, and her cheeks were very pink. Please, my angels, please try and forget what I said. We want our princesses to always try their best, not just because they want to win a place in a wonderful coach. It's all right, Fairy Angora, Olivia said. We won't even think about the coach. And we all nodded, except for Diamond. She gave Fairy Angora such a sly look. If we pretend we don't know about this coach, she said, will we get extra Tiara points for ballet? That's right. Gruella agreed. Lots of Tiara points, so we're sure to ride in the coach. I was so shocked. We all know that perfect princesses never ever talk like that. And Fairy Angora went positively pale, but then she folded her arms and frowned. Princess Diamond and Princess Gruella, she said, just this once I will overlook the way you have spoken to me, because I should never have asked you to keep a secret. She stopped and looked at me. Amy, would you be an angel and run along to Fairy G's office? Please ask her if I can borrow her forgetting dust. She turned back to the class. Teal sprinkle a little in this room, and all of you will forget what I have said. That way none of us will need to worry about Tiara points and the golden coach. And now, let's go back to our ballet lesson. As I hurried out of the door, I saw Diamond and Gruella looking so disappointed. Fairy G is the head fairy godmother, and she has offices all over the Princess Academy. Her room in Ruby Mansions was at the end of a long marble corridor, and the maids were busy polishing the floor as I walked up to her door and knocked. Come in, she called, and I went inside. Fairy G was sitting behind her desk knitting something ruby red and sparkly. She saw me looking, and smiled. It's a shawl to wear to the celebration ball, she explained. For when you're presented with your ruby sashes. What can I do for you, Amy dear? I curtsied, and told her that Fairy Angora needed to borrow some forgetting dust. Fairy G's eyebrows zoomed up, but all she said was, of course. You'll find it over there on the shelf, the yellow bottle. Fairy G's shelves were absolutely stuffed with jars and bags and bottles. I think she must have used magic to find what she wanted, because they were so untidy and higgledy-piggledy. When I reached up and took the yellow bottle off the shelf, a collection of odd-looking twigs and dried flowers nearly fell on top of me, but at the last minute Fairy G waved her wand, and they flew back to the place they'd come from. Tell Fairy Angora to use the dust carefully, Amy, Fairy G said. It's powerful stuff. And remind her it only lasts a day or two. Yes, Fairy G, I said. Thank you very much. The marble corridor was gleaming as I came out of Fairy G's room. The maids had gone, but the floor was still a little bit wet. I walked very carefully, and I'd so nearly got back to our classroom when I sneezed, and I don't know how it happened, but my feet slid from under me. I grabbed at the door to save myself, and dropped the yellow bottle, and it crashed to the floor and broke into a million little pieces. Chapter 3. Oh and oh. I wailed. Oh no. I didn't know what to do. I stared at the mess in horror, my heart thudding in my chest, and then the strangest feeling crept into my head. It felt like fog in my brain, and I couldn't remember where I was, and why I was looking at lots of yellow powder and broken glass spread in front of me. The door beside me opened, and Fairy Angora popped her head out. Amy, she said. What was that crash? Are you all right? And then she saw the mess. Is that the forgetting dust? Quick! Come inside. She grabbed my hand and pulled me into the classroom. As she slammed the door behind me, a little cloud of yellow powder flew into the air, and the foggy feeling in my head grew stronger. Amy! Amy? Fairy Angora waved her wand over my head. Do you know who I am? It was so weird. I knew her name, but I just couldn't think what it was. I began. I'm so sorry. Oh. What's the matter with Amy? Asked a spiteful voice. Has she gone mad? I rubbed my head furiously. I knew who had spoken, but I couldn't remember her name either. Was I really going mad? Fairy Angora tapped my shoulder twice with her wand and said, "Forgetting dust, your task is done. Please leave Amy 321. My head cleared at once. Thank you, Fairy Angora, I said. I'm so very sorry I dropped the bottle. Should I get a dustpan and brush? Fairy Angora shook her head. Even though I've taken the spell away, you'd forget what you were doing after a second or two. Don't worry about it, my angel. Anyone can have an accident. The spiteful voice, and I knew now that it belonged to Diamond. If you ask me, only clumsy people fall over and drop precious spells. Gruella sniggered. Clumsy people like Elephant Amy. Diamond. Gruella. Fairy Angora was really cross. I've had quite enough of your nasty little comments. Kindly go and sit in the corner until I say you can get up again. She watched the twins stamp across to the chairs in the corner, then turned to the rest of us. I'm very sorry, my petals, but I'll have to ask you to stay in this room until the forgetting dust is cleared away from outside. And don't go near the door either. I'll set you a task, and then I'll fetch Fairy G to help me tidy it up. Now let's try those pirouettes again, shall we? Ready? 1, 2, 3, twirl. And the most amazing thing happened. I found myself spinning across the room as if I'd been doing ballet all my life. It was so strange. As I came to a halt on the other side of the room, Fairy Angora clapped her hands. Well done, Amy, she said. That was wonderful. 5 Tiara points. There was a loud angry snort from Diamond, and Gruella whispered, That's so not fair. You only got 2 points. I know. And I bet it's the magic dust that's making Amy do that, Diamond hissed back. Fairy Angora overheard her. Actually, Diamond, it isn't magic. Sometimes when you clear away forgetting dust, it makes your memory sharper. Did you do ballet when you were little, Amy? I nodded. Fairy Angora beamed. That'll be the reason, then. You're just remembering an old skill. Now, please get into groups. I'd like you to work out a lovely dance sequence while I run and fetch Fairy G, and after we've taken the magic dust away, I'll ask her to watch you dancing. Of course, all of us Poppy Roomers hurried together to make a group, and as usual, Diamond and Gruella decided they were going to work together. Fairy Angora waited until she saw we were busy, and then carefully opened the door and slipped out. As the door closed, Diamond hurried towards it, pulling Gruella behind her. I want some of that magic powder, she said. I just know that's what made stupid Amy dance like that. She bent down, opened the door, and scooped as much forgetting dust as she could from the floor. With a huge smile, she put her fingers to her nose and sniffed hard. Chapter 4. It was so weird. Diamond blinked, sneezed, and said in a squeaky voice, Where am I? Gruella stared at her. Don't be silly, Diamond, she said. You're in a ballet lesson. Ballet? Diamond clapped her hands. Oh! I love ballet. And she hopped and thumped across the floor as if she was a little toddler. Diamond! Gruella sounded really quite frightened. Stop it! Lauren shook her head. I don't think she can stop, she said. I think it's the forgetting dust working. She's forgotten how old she is. But she can't keep behaving like a 2-year-old. Gruella gasped. We'll never get any extra Tiara points if she can't dance properly. La dee dee dee, la dee dee dee. Diamond sang, and she did a little twirl and fell over. She sat on the floor and laughed. Silly Billy me. Diamond did go all fall down. I'm sure Fairy Angora will be able to take the spell off again. Georgia said hopefully. She did with Amy. But she'll be furious with Diamond. Gruella wailed. She told us not to go near the door. And we've just got to get some more Tiara points, or we won't win our ruby sashes tomorrow and get to go to Pearl Palace in the golden coach. I looked at Diamond, who was sitting on the floor sucking her thumb. It was odd, but I couldn't help feeling just a little bit sorry for her and Gruella. I know the twins are absolutely horrible most of the time, but they do care about each other. Do you know what? I said slowly. I might just have an idea. Do you really? Gruella's eyes lit up. Oh, Amy! If you help us, I promise I'll be nice to you forever and ever. Well, I began, it depends if the rest of Poppy Room are willing to help. Of course we are. Georgia sounded most indignant. You know we will, Amy. That's right. Jessica nodded hard. Poppy Room to the rescue. I smiled my thanks, and went on, supposing we did a dance where we all pretended that Diamond was pretending to be a little girl? And we were teaching her all the different ballet steps? That way we get to show off what we could do, and maybe Fairy Angora and Fairy G won't notice she's under a spell until it wears off. Fairy G told me it only lasts a day. All my friends and Gruella gazed at me. Amy! Chloe said. That's so brilliant. How did you think of it? It's perfect. I could feel myself blushing. Thanks very much, I mumbled. Shall we get started? By the time Fairy Angora came back with Fairy G, we'd worked out a whole dance routine. I don't want to sound boastful, but it worked better than I'd even dared to hope. We showed Diamond the different steps, and she laughed and clapped her hands and did her best to copy us exactly as if she was about 2 years old. It was actually really good fun. Diamond was so sweet. And Gruella was lovely too, although we did keep having to tell her not to look so worried. We knew when the 2 fairy godmothers were outside because we heard Fairy G's huge voice booming, forgetting dust upon the ground, back in the bottle, safe and sound. There was a bright yellow flash, and then the door opened, and Fairy G sailed in with the bottle in her hand looking as if it had never been broken. Fairy Angora floated behind her smiling happily. There, my angels, she said. All better. And now show us what you've been doing. We were the last to show our dance, and it was a bit difficult while we were waiting because Diamond kept whispering, "Want a bicky? Want some juice?" Luckily we managed to keep her quiet, although I did wonder if Fairy G was peering in our direction once or twice. When we came to show off our routine though, Diamond was wonderful. Fairy G and Fairy Angora clapped and clapped, and we were given 15 Tiara points each. Well done! Fairy Angora was positively glowing, she was so pleased. And I'm so happy that you've worked so hard, Diamond. You've more than made up for your bad behavior earlier. Yes. Tanko, nice fairy. And before we could stop her, Diamond rushed forward and gave Fairy Angora a huge hug. I is a good girl, she said as she fluttered her eyelashes madly. I is pretty Princess Diamond. Tee hee hee. And she twirled round and round the room until she fell over again and sat laughing at us. Chapter 5. Diamond. Fairy Angora didn't look very pleased. You don't need to go on pretending now, you know. And Fairy G didn't look very happy either. She folded her arms and looked stern. I'm sorry to tell you, Fairy Angora, but Diamond isn't pretending. It seems to me there's been some very clever thinking here to cover up the use of the forgetting dust. Who is responsible for this? My heart began to pitter-pat in my chest, but I had to step forward. Please, Fairy G, it was me. But all of a sudden the most extraordinary thing happened. Diamond smiled and pulled herself to her feet and said, Amy is a good girl, big fairy. It was me what did play with the fairy dust. She put her head on one side and rolled her eyes. Diamond is a bad girl. And she slapped her own wrist and giggled. There was a long silence, and then Fairy G began to laugh. She laughed, and before long we were all laughing too, even Gruella and Diamond. You know, Fairy G said as she wiped her streaming eyes, we don't need a competition tomorrow. I know exactly who should ride in Queer Fabiola's golden coach and lead the cavalcade to Pearl Palace. Princess Amy, you're a star. And so are all of Poppy Room and, I'm delighted to say, Gruella as well. And I hope Diamond will appreciate just how generous you've been, and how very, very kind. Fairy Angora nodded. Should we take the forgetting dust away? She asked. Fairy G stroked her chin thoughtfully. I think perhaps we should, she said. Forgetting dust, your task is done. Leave Diamond, 3, 2, 1. Tiny yellow sparkles filled the air, and Diamond rubbed her eyes and yawned as if she'd just woken up. She looked round at us all, and smiled a really lovely smile. Hello, she said. I've just had the strangest dream. I dreamt I was little, and you were all being so sweet to me. Thank you. Olivia nudged me. Do you think she might have forgotten how to be mean? She whispered. I don't know, I whispered back. Let's just enjoy it while it lasts. And we did. Diamond went on being lovely for all of the rest of the day, and the next day too. When we rode in the glorious golden coach to Pearl Palace, she insisted I sat in the very best seat. As we lined up in front of Queen Fabiola to receive our ruby sashes, she told our head teacher that I was the nicest girl in the whole of the Princess Academy. As the music began for the celebration ball, she curtsied to me and said, Amy, I know I've sometimes been mean to you, but can we be friends? Real friends? And I smiled at her and said, of course we can. And I really truly meant it, but I couldn't help noticing that as the evening went on she tried harder and harder to be the best at every dance. When she pushed Georgia out of the way so she could take the biggest helping of strawberry jelly, I knew the spell had finally worn off, but it had been nice while it lasted, and as I snuggled down in Poppy Room that night I thought, I've got so many really wonderful friends that I don't mind if Diamond and Gruella are sometimes horrible. There's Chloe, and Olivia, and Georgia and Lauren and Jessica, and best of all, there's you. And we're all going to be together again very, very soon, because next term we'll all be at Pearl Palace. So hurrah for the Tiara Club!